In this lesson, what we're going to do is spend some time thinking about the role, the influence, the concerns, and the policies of the provisional government, the government that takes control in Petrograd and throughout the rest of the Russian state, shall I say, in the interim period between the February Revolution and the establishment of Bolshevik authority in October. We'll talk about some of the key leaders, and we'll talk about really, why does the provisional government fail? What are some of the things that presents the provisional government as an interim measure, an interim position that fails compared to that of the growing authority of the Petrograd Soviet, but then also the authority of the Bolsheviks that take control in October? Because the provisional government would have, if the provisional government was to be a success, it would have likely have utilised the establishment of some kind of constitutional democracy. There would likely have not been a Bolshevik revolution in October. So why was there? That's the question that I'm going to think about in this lesson as we think about the provisional government. So the first question is, what was the provisional government? And this is very, very simple. The provisional government emerged immediately after the abdication of the Tsar. It technically emerged in the sort of interim before the abdication of the Tsar, but it consolidated its authority after the abdication of the Tsar during the February Revolution. It was established by the Duma as a temporary governing body. The idea here is to oversee a transition to a democratic constitutional state of Russia and to organize elections for a newly founded constituent assembly. So it was going to present with liberal policies, the idea of liberal politics, a little bit like how the Weimar Constitution is established in 1918, a year later. But of course, this is not what happens. We don't get liberal politics, we get a communist revolution. So this is the basic idea here. Its leadership concerned had two individuals really, mainly within this sort of broader conversation. You have the prime minister at the time, Prince Georgy Lvov, who served as the first prime minister, who was very quickly succeeded by Alexander Kerensky and became the dominant figure by mid-1917. Its core mission is very simple. Its mandate was to be provisional. The governing position of the provisional government was to essentially rule and to operate until a constituent assembly could be elected. This then constituent assembly would then have the ability to determine the nation's long-term political structure. That's the sort of basic idea of the provisional government. And when I say the provisional government failed, of course, it was always meant to be a temporary institution, so it was always going to disappear and dissipate at some point. But when I say it failed, is that the clear vision of the leaders within the provisional government, the leaders within the Duma, the State Duma more generally, were associated with the establishment of a constituent assembly to draw up a constitution for a democratic, liberal system of governance, not what actually ends up happening, which is, of course, the overthrow of the sort of liberal transitionary team and the overthrow of all of this in favour of a Bolshevik consolidation. In the early weeks, then, the provisional government implemented a series of sweeping liberal reforms. They do go about a number of different policies very, very quickly. They issued, for example, immediate amnesty for political and religious prisoners. They also abolished the secret police that existed under the Tsarist regime, the Okhrana, and also they abolished the death penalty and government censorship. They established freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of unions, freedom to strike. And then they also introduced universal suffrage. They reintroduced the jury trial. They reintroduced local self-governance. These used to exist in institutions called the Zemstva prior to the sort of greater amount of crackdown that we see taking place under first Alexander III and then Nicholas II. And they also removed barriers based on things like class, religion, and nationality. And a very important thing they did was they promised elections to a constituent assembly. So all quite sweeping liberal reforms that we are seeing straight away immediately at this point. But you'll notice one thing specifically, points for what this thing is, but there's one thing on this list of policies of the provisional government that is notably absent, and I want you to think about what that is, and we'll get to that in a second. But think in the back of your mind what that policy might be that I'm thinking about. In terms of structural weaknesses, the first problem is that there was a lack of legitimacy because the provisional government derives out of the Duma, the State Duma that had been dissolved by Nicholas in 1915. The government itself was unelected and therefore perceived as lacking any kind of democratic mandate. Even though they promised constituent elections, this was after the provisional government had been and done its work. So the provisional government itself was unelected. There was also the delayed setting of elections for the Constituent Assembly. So they promised elections to a Constituent Assembly, and then they delayed that date at which those elections would take place, further undermining legitimacy. You also have the fact that they are competing with what was perceived to be a more legitimate institution, the Petrograd Soviet. The reason why the Petrograd Soviet was seen as more legitimate than the provisional government is partially because it was a council that represented workers and soldiers. So it had a greater amount of representation for the class of individuals who would eventually contribute, who did contribute to the overthrowing of the Tsar, and who will eventually contribute to the overthrowing of the provisional government and the October Revolution. The Soviet also held actual control over key institutional parts of infrastructure. They held actual control over railways, over communications, over local councils. You also have the fact that, as I mentioned in the previous lesson, the Petrograd Soviet Order No. 1 directed soldiers to obey the Soviet over the provisional government, to obey the Soviet over basically everything. They said that Order No. 1 was an order to only take commands and orders and issues from the Soviet and from no other institution, which of course rules out the provisional government as well. This destabilizes military obedience, and we can see that there is a clear sharing of authority, dual authority here, but there is also a disparity in terms of ideological predilections, ideological outlooks. So the provisional government is very different to the Petrograd Soviet, and so they're going to clash eventually.